AOC insults John Kennedy. Sit down, boy. But his response shocks all of America. The air inside the CNN debate studio was heavy charged with an electricity that seemed to hum through the polished floors and bounce off the sleek modern set. Rows of lights blazed overhead, casting a stark glow on the two figures seated at the center of the stage, each poised in their own way like gladiators awaiting the first strike. On one side sat Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the fiery Democratic congresswoman from New York known to the world as AOC. Her dark hair was pulled back neatly, her eyes sharp and unyielding, her red blazer a bold statement against the neutral backdrop. At 36, she was a force of nature, a social media juggernaut whose every word could ignite a movement or spark a firestorm. Her presence radiated energy, the kind that drew every eye in the room and millions more watching from screens across the country. Across from her sat John Kennedy, the senior senator from Louisiana, a man whose folksy charm and sharp wit had made him a fixture in American politics. At 74, Kennedy carried himself with the calm assurance of someone who'd seen it all. Decades of legislative battles, countless debates, and a career built on blending Southern drawl with cutting intellect. His gray suit was understated, his posture relaxed, but his eyes glinted with the focus of a man who knew exactly where he stood and wasn't about to be moved. The audience, a mix of journalists, political insiders, and everyday citizens, sat, intense anticipation, their whispers fading as Anderson Cooper stepped to the podium, his voice steady, but tinged with the weight of what was about to unfold. This wasn't just another debate. It was a clash of generations, ideologies, and visions for America's future set against the backdrop of a nation grappling with division. Tonight's topic, energy policy, a subject that had become a lightning rod in a world increasingly defined by climate crises and economic realities. The stakes were high, the cameras were rolling, and the country was watching. Anderson Cooper's voice cut through the silence, welcoming the audience and laying out the rules. Tonight, we're here to discuss one of the most pressing issues facing our nation: how to balance energy independence with the urgent need for sustainable solutions. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Kennedy, thank you for joining us. He turned to AOC first, his question sharp and direct. Congresswoman, you've been a vocal advocate for the Green New Deal and a rapid transition to renewable energy. Critics argue your proposals are too costly and disruptive to industries like oil and gas. How do you respond? AOC leaned forward, her hands clasped lightly on the table, her voice clear and confident. Anderson, the question isn't whether we can afford to transition to clean energy. It's whether we can afford not to. Climate change is an existential threat. We're seeing wildfires, hurricanes, and heat waves devastate communities, including right here in America. My plan isn't just about cutting emissions. It's about creating millions of jobs, rebuilding our infrastructure, and ensuring no one gets left behind. The cost of inaction is far greater than the cost of bold action. Her words were crisp, rehearsed, yet passionate, drawing nods from some in the audience and a few murmurs from others. She glanced at Kennedy, a subtle challenge in her eyes, as if daring him to counter her vision of a transformed America. Cooper turned to Kennedy. Senator, your response. Kennedy adjusted his glasses, a small smile playing at the corner of his mouth, his Louisiana drawl softening the edges of his words. Well, Anderson, I appreciate the Congresswoman's enthusiasm. I do, but let's talk straight. Energy is not just about ideals. It's about people's livelihoods. In Louisiana, oil and gas aren't just industries, they're how folks put food on the table. You can't just flip a switch and shut down refineries without a plan that doesn't leave workers high and dry. Renewables are part of the future, sure, but we need a bridge, not a cliff. His tone was measured, almost conversational, but carried a weight that resonated with the audience, particularly those skeptical of rapid change. The debate began to heat up as AOC fired back, her voice rising slightly, but still controlled. Senator, with all due respect, that's the kind of thinking that's kept us stuck for decades. We can't keep kicking the can down the road while our planet chokes. The Green New Deal isn't just a dream, it's a blueprint. We're talking about solar, wind, geothermal, and yes, jobs for those same workers. You're talking about retraining programs, infrastructure investments. This isn't about leaving anyone behind. It's about bringing everyone forward. The audience clapped, some enthusiastically, others more reserved, sensing the growing tension. Kennedy nodded slowly, as if considering her words, then leaned into his microphone. Congresswoman, I've heard a lot of blueprints in my time. Most of them look real pretty on paper, but don't hold up when the rubber meets the road. You're talking about retraining folks, but I've met rig workers in Louisiana who've been at it for 30 years. They don't want a government handout or a coding boot camp. They want to know their way of life ain't going to be yanked out from under them. His words struck a chord, earning applause from a portion of the audience, particularly those who saw him as a defender of traditional industries. AOC's eyes narrowed, her smile tight but unwavering. Senator, it's not about handouts. It's about opportunity. If we don't act now, those same workers will face a future where their jobs disappear because the world's moved on without us. We're not just fighting for today, we're fighting for tomorrow. The exchange was sharp but civil, a classic clash of progressive idealism versus pragmatic realism. For the first 15 minutes, the debate followed a predictable rhythm. AOC pushed for bold systemic change while Kennedy countered with calls for moderation and practicality. The audience leaned in, captivated by the contrast, her urgency against his restraint, her vision of transformation against his defense of stability. But the air shifted when Cooper posed a new question, one that cut deeper than policy. Congresswoman, Senator, there's been growing criticism that energy debates often ignore the human cost, whether it's job losses in fossil fuel regions or the impact of climate disasters on vulnerable communities. How do you ensure your policies reflect the real needs of Americans? AOC seized the moment, her voice rising with conviction. This is exactly why we need a new approach. Climate change hits hardest at communities that have been ignored for too long: low-income families, communities of color, rural areas. My plan prioritizes them with funding for clean energy projects in places like the Bronx, not just Silicon Valley. We're talking about justice, not just jobs. Her words drew cheers, particularly from younger audience members who saw her as a champion for equity. Kennedy, however, tilted his head, his expression unreadable. Justice is a fine word, Congresswoman, he said, his voice steady but pointed, but I'm not sure it pays the bills. For a single mom in Shreveport who's worried about her next paycheck. You can't eat justice. You can't heat your home with it. We need solutions that don't just sound good, but work for folks who don't have the luxury of waiting for your utopia. The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement, others shifting uncomfortably. AOC's jaw tightened, her patience visibly thinning. She leaned forward, her tone sharp, but still measured. Senator, I'm not talking about utopia. I'm talking about survival. The science is clear. We're running out of time. If we don't invest in clean energy now, we're not just failing that single mom in Shreveport. We're failing her kids, her grandkids, and every generation after. This isn't about waiting. It's about acting. The audience erupted in applause, but there was an undercurrent of tension, a sense that the debate was teetering on the edge of something bigger. Kennedy's smile faded slightly, but he held his ground, his voice calm yet firm. I don't disagree that we need to act, Congresswoman, but action that bankrupts communities in the name of progress, inaction. It's ideology. Folks in my state don't need lectures on survival. They're living it every day. The crowd responded with a mix of claps and murmurs, the divide in the room becoming palpable. It was clear that both were playing to their bases, but the stakes were climbing higher with every exchange. Then came the moment that would change everything. AOC, perhaps sensing an opportunity to seize control, leaned forward, her eyes locked on Kennedy. Senator, let's be real. Your approach is stuck in the past, defending industries that are dying while the world moves forward. Maybe it's time for some folks to step aside and let a new generation lead. The audience gasped softly, sensing the shift from policy to personal. Kennedy raised an eyebrow, his expression still composed, but there was a flicker of something, annoyance perhaps or amusement, before he could respond. AOC pressed further, her voice cutting through the studio like a blade. "Sit down, boy," she said, her tone dripping with condescension, a smirk playing at the edge of her lips. The words landed like a thunderclap. The studio fell silent, the kind of silence that feels like the world holding its breath. Anderson Cooper froze, his pen hovering over his notes. The audience sat stunned, some clutching their programs, others exchanging wide-eyed glances. In the control room, CNN producers scrambled their headsets, buzzing with frantic chatter. "Did she just say that?" One whispered while another hissed, "Keep the cameras rolling." Social media exploded within seconds. Hashtags like #AOCVs Kennedy and #SitDownBoy trending as viewers across the country reacted in real time. Some called it a bold power move, others a reckless misstep. But everyone agreed this was no longer just a debate. The phrase "boy" hung in the air, its weight undeniable. For a man like Kennedy, a seasoned senator from the South, the word carried a history, a sting that echoed beyond the moment. AOC's supporters in the crowd cheered, seeing it as a defiant stand against an older entrenched establishment, but others, including some of her own allies, winced, sensing she'd crossed a line. The camera zoomed in on Kennedy, whose face remained impassive, his hands folded calmly on the table. He didn't flinch, didn't raise his voice, didn't even blink. Instead, he tilted his head slightly, as if studying AOC, sizing her up, not as an opponent, but as someone who just made a grave mistake. The silence stretched agonizing as the audience waited for his response. Anderson Cooper, recovering, tried to steer the conversation back. Senator, would you like to respond to the Congresswoman's point about generational leadership?" But Kennedy didn't need prompting. He leaned into his microphone, his voice slow and deliberate, each word chosen with the precision of a man who'd spent decades navigating the sharp edges of politics. "Congresswoman," he began his draw, softening the steel in his tone. "I've been called a lot of things in my time, but I got to say, that's a new one." A ripple of nervous laughter broke the tension, but Kennedy's eyes never left AOC's. "You want to talk about leadership? Fine, let's talk about it. But let's do it with facts, not cheap shots." The audience leaned forward, sensing the shift. Kennedy's calm was disarming his refusal to match AOC's fire with fire, catching her off guard. AOC's smirk faltered just for a moment as she realized she might have underestimated her opponent. Kennedy continued, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that filled the room. "You see, I don't think leadership's about who's loudest or who's got the most followers online. It's about listening to folks, real folks, not just the ones who agree with you. It's about knowing that the policies you push don't just affect headlines, they affect people's lives." He paused, letting his words sink in, his gaze sweeping the audience before returning to AOC. "Now, you want to call me boy and tell me to sit down, that's your choice, but I'm not here to play games. I'm here to talk about what keeps this country running, energy, jobs, and the folks who depend on both." The crowd erupted, a mix of applause and cheers, some for Kennedy's restraint, others for his directness. AOC shifted in her seat, her confidence still intact, but visibly rattled, as if she hadn't expected Kennedy to absorb her blow and turn it back on her so effortlessly. The cameras panned across the studio, capturing the reactions, a young woman in the front row clapping vigorously for AOC, an older man nodding solemnly at Kennedy's words, a CNN producer whispering into a headset, This is gold. On social media, the debate was already spiraling into a cultural moment, with memes of AOC's sit-down quip and Kennedy's calm response flooding feeds. Commentators were split. Some praised AOC's boldness. Others called it a miscalculation that alienated moderates, but one thing was clear. The debate had transcended policy. It was now about respect, power, and the fault lines that ran through a divided America. Anderson Cooper tried to regain control, his voice cutting through the noise. Let's move to our next question: specific policies for transitioning to renewable energy. But the audience wasn't ready to move on, and neither were the candidates. AOC, sensing the need to reclaim the narrative, leaned forward, her eyes blazing. Senator, I'm not here to disrespect anyone, but I'm also not here to coddle outdated ideas. We need leaders who can face the future, not cling to the past. Kennedy's smile returned small but sharp as he adjusted his glasses. Congresswoman, the future's important, but so is the present. And right now, folks are worried about paying their bills, not chasing dreams that sound good on paper. The crowd murmured again, the divide deepening as the debate barreled toward an inevitable escalation. What happened next would not only define the night, but leave a mark on the nation as Kennedy prepared to show America exactly how a seasoned leader responds when pushed afar. The CNN studio buzzed with a restless energy, the echo of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez's sit-down voice still reverberating through the audience like a struck chord. The camera's unblinking captured every flicker of emotion. Anderson Cooper's strained neutrality, AOC's defiant posture, and John Kennedy's unshakable calm. The Louisiana senator sat with his hands folded, his face a study in composure, but his eyes held a glint of resolve that hadn't been there before. The audience split between those cheering AOC's boldness and those unsettled by her jab leaned forward, sensing that Kennedy was about to respond in a way that would shift the night's momentum. Social media was already ablaze, with that sit-down boy trending alongside clips of Kennedy's initial retort. But the real battle was unfolding live under the relentless glare of the studio lights. Anderson Cooper, eager to steer the debate back to policy, cleared his throat and leaned into his microphone. Senator Kennedy, let's return to the topic of energy policy. You've emphasized the need for a practical transition to renewables. Can you outline what that looks like for states like Louisiana, heavily reliant on oil and gas? It was a lifeline, a chance to move past the personal and back to substance. But Kennedy wasn't ready to let the moment slip away entirely. He adjusted his glasses, his small smile sharpening, and began to speak his Louisiana drawl, wrapping each word in a deceptive warmth. Anderson, I appreciate the question, and I'm happy to talk policy because that's what folks at home care about, how they're going to keep their lights on and their families fed. He paused, glancing at AOC, who sat with her arms crossed, her expression a mix of defiance and weariness. But before I dive into that, let me just say this. I've been in politics a long time, and I've learned that when someone starts throwing insults instead of ideas, it's usually because they're running low on the ladder. The audience chuckled a ripple of laughter, breaking the tension. But Kennedy's tone remained steady, his gaze fixed on AOC. Now, Congresswoman, you want to lead. That's fine, but leadership ain't about who can yell the loudest or get the most likes. It's about delivering for people who don't have the luxury of waiting for your grand plans to pan out. The crowd erupted in applause this time, particularly from older audience members who nodded in approval. AOC's jaw tightened, but she held her ground, her eyes narrowing as she prepared to counter. Kennedy, however, wasn't done setting the stage. So, let's talk energy since that's what we're here for. And let's do it with facts, not feelings. Kennedy leaned forward, his voice gaining strength, but never losing its conversational ease. Louisiana's got about 190,000 jobs tied to oil and gas. That's not just numbers. That's welders, rig workers, truck drivers, folks who get up at dawn and come home dog-tired to provide for their kids. The Congresswoman's Green New Deal sounds mighty fine in a speech, but it's light on how it keeps those folks employed while we're switching to windmills and solar panels. Now, I'm all for clean energy. Nobody wants dirty air or water, least of all me. But you can't just shut down one industry overnight and expect the other to magically take its place. That's not a plan, that's a prayer. The audience clapped again, the sound swelling as Kennedy's words resonated with those skeptical of rapid change. He held up a hand, signaling he wasn't finished. Here's the kicker. The Energy Information Administration says oil and gas still account for about 60% of our energy consumption. Renewables about 12%. Now, I'm no math genius, but that's a big gap to close and it ain't happening by 2030, no matter how many hashtags you throw at it. A few laughs broke out, but Kennedy's point landed hard. His use of data cutting through the emotional rhetoric AOC had leaned into earlier. AOC shifted in her seat, her fingers tapping lightly on the table, a sign she was itching to respond. Her eyes flicked to Cooper, then back to Kennedy as if calculating her next move. Kennedy pressed on his voice now, carrying a quiet authority. In Louisiana, we've been working on clean energy to geothermal carbon capture, even offshore wind projects, but we're doing it with a plan that doesn't gut our economy. For example, we've got companies like Chainer Energy exporting liquefied natural gas, which is cleaner than coal and helps our allies overseas. That's jobs, that's security, and that's progress without leaving folks behind. He turned to AOC, his tone polite but pointed. Congresswoman, your plan calls for spending trillions. Some say 90 trillion over a decade. I'm curious, where's that money coming from? And how do you tell a refinery worker in Baton Rouge that his job's gone? But don't worry, he'll get a check in the mail. The question hung in the air, sharp and unavoidable, drawing murmurs from the crowd. Kennedy leaned back, his expression calm but expectant as if inviting AOC to step into the trap he'd laid. Anderson Cooper seized the moment to pivot. Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez, your response. AOC leaned forward, her voice steady but laced with urgency, her earlier smirk replaced by a determined focus. Senator, I hear you talking about jobs, and I agree. People's livelihoods matter, but let's not pretend the status quo is sustainable. Oil and gas might be 60% of our energy now, but they're also driving climate disasters that cost billions every year. Hurricanes in Louisiana, wildfires in California, floods in New York. These aren't just weather, they're warnings. My plan isn't about destroying jobs, it's about creating them. The Green New Deal would fund retraining programs for fossil fuel workers, invest in clean energy infrastructure, and prioritize communities like those in Louisiana that have been hit hardest by pollution and storms. Her words drew applause, particularly from younger audience members. But Kennedy's earlier points about cost and feasibility lingered, tempering the enthusiasm. AOC pressed on, her voice rising. And let's talk about that $90 trillion figure you keep throwing around. That's a scare tactic, not a fact. Independent studies like one from the American Action Forum estimate costs closer to $50 trillion, and that includes long-term savings from avoiding climate catastrophe. We pay for it the same way we pay for anything else, by taxing wealth hoarding, closing corporate loopholes, and investing in our future. The crowd clapped, but the response was less fervent than before, as if Kennedy's grounded approach had sown seeds of doubt. Kennedy tilted his head, his smile returning small but knowing. Congresswoman, I admire your optimism, but $50 trillion still a mighty big number. And those studies you're citing, they also say your plan could disrupt millions of jobs before those new ones show up. Folks in my state don't have time to wait for a tax on billionaires to maybe fund a job training program that might work. They need certainty, not promises. His words were simple but effective, resonating with the audience's practical concerns. AOC's eyes flashed, her patience thinning. Senator, certainty. The only certainty in your approach is more pollution, more disasters, and more excuses for why we can't act. The world's moving to clean energy. China's investing billions in solar. Europe's phasing out coal. If we don't lead, we'll be left behind. Kennedy nodded as if conceding the point, but his response was swift. China's building coal plants faster than they're building solar panels. Congresswoman, and Europe, they're paying sky-high energy bills because they moved too fast without a backup. I'm all for leading, but let's not lead ourselves off a cliff. The exchange was electric, a masterclass in contrasting styles, her passion against his pragmatism, her vision against his caution. The audience was fully engaged, clapping and murmuring as each landed their points. But AOC, perhaps sensing she was losing ground, shifted tactics. Senator, it's not just about numbers. It's about values. Do we value profits over people? Do we value the past over the future? Your approach feels like it's stuck in a time when we could ignore the science. The crowd stirred, some cheering her moral clarity, others bristling at the implication. Kennedy's expression didn't change, but his voice took on a new edge. Values. I value the folks who keep this country running, the ones who drill the oil, refine the gas, and pay the taxes that fund your plans. And science. I'm all for it. But science don't pay the rent when your job's gone because someone in Washington decided your industry is obsolete. The applause was thunderous, the loudest of the night, as Kennedy's words struck a chord with those who felt overlooked by lofty policy proposals. AOC's face tightened, her earlier confidence shaken, but not broken. She opened her mouth to respond, but Cooper interjected, sensing the need to cool things down. Let's take a brief pause and move to our next question. After this, the cameras panned to the audience, capturing their divided reactions, some standing to clap for Kennedy, others nodding in support of AOC. In the control room, producers were ecstatic, their screens showing record viewership numbers. On social media, the debate was a wildfire, with users dissecting every moment from Kennedy's data-driven takedown to AOC's fiery rebuttals. But the night was far from over. Kennedy had reclaimed the narrative, turning AOC's insult into an opportunity to showcase his experience and connect with the audience's real-world concerns. AOC, however, was not one to back down as the debate prepared to resume the tension. In the studio was palpable, a promise that the next round would be even more intense. Kennedy had drawn first blood, but AOC was ready to fight back, and the country was watching to see who would emerge as the voice of reason in a divided America. The CNN studio buzzed with tension as the debate between Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, and John Kennedy reached its climax. The audience sat riveted, their murmurs, now a low hum of anticipation, eyes fixed on the two candidates. AOC in a striking red blazer leaned forward, determination in her posture, but frustration flickering across her face. Opposite her, Kennedy sat composed in a gray suit, his calm demeanor masking a sharp intellect that had just shifted the debate in his favor. His data-driven arguments had put AOC on the defense of her earlier "sit down, boy" quip, now a lingering liability. Social media was ablaze with #Kennedy strikes. Backtrending though, AOC's passionate rebuttals still energized her base. Anderson Cooper, sensing the mounting tension, leaned into his microphone, his voice steady but urgent. "Let's move to our next question," he said, glancing between the candidates. "Both of you have outlined your energy policies, but how do you address criticism that they overlook the immediate needs of working-class Americans?" Congresswoman, you're first. The question offered AOC a chance to recover, but Kennedy's earlier points loomed large. She took a deep breath, scanning the crowd before locking eyes with Cooper. "Anderson, this is why the Green New Deal is critical." She began, her voice firm. "It's not just about climate, it's about people. Working-class families in places like the Bronx, where I grew up, bear the brunt of pollution, asthma, and storms that flood their homes. My plan invests in those communities, creating good-paying union jobs, in clean energy, building solar farms, retrofitting schools, with rising homes. Her words drew applause, especially from younger audience members, but she wasn't done. Turning to Kennedy, her tone sharpened. Senator, your approach defends an industry poisoning those same communities. Oil and gas profits go to CEOs, not workers. How can you claim to fight for the working class when your policies chain them to a dying industry? The crowd erupted, some cheering AOC's boldness, others shifting uncomfortably at her pointed attack. Social media amplified the moment with clips captioned, "AOC calls out big oil," but Kennedy's expression tightened, his calm facade showing a faint crack. Cooper turned to Kennedy. "Senator, your response." Kennedy adjusted his glasses, a small deliberate smile forming. "Congresswoman, I don't defend industries. I defend people," he said, his Louisiana drawl softening the steel in his words. "That includes the 190,000 Louisianans whose jobs depend on oil and gas." You talk about dignity, and I agree. Nothing's more dignified than a paycheck earned with your own hands. But your plan promises jobs that don't exist yet while eliminating the ones folks rely on today. That's not justice. That's gambling with people's lives. The audience clapped, the sound swelling as Kennedy's words resonated. He leaned forward, his voice steady but intense. "Let me tell you about Marcus, a welder in Lake Charles, been working on rigs for 25 years, supports his wife and 3 kids. He's not a CEO, just a man who shows up every day." How does your plan help Marcus when his job vanishes and your retraining program's years away? I've read your Green New Deal. It's long on vision, but short on answers for folks like him. The crowd roared Kennedy's story, grounding the debate in human terms. AOC's eyes flashed her patience, fraying. "Senator, I'm not gambling with anyone's lives," she shot back, her voice rising. "Marcus deserves better than a job killing his community's air and water. My plan delivers $10 billion in workforce development targeted at places like Lake Charles, hiring locally for infrastructure projects. Oil and gas aren't the future, renewables are. If we don't act, we'll be left behind while other countries lead." Her words drew cheers, but they were less unified, as if Kennedy's story had planted doubts. She pressed on, her tone sharper. "Your resistance to change, Senator, protects the past, not the future. Maybe it's time for leaders who understand the stakes to step up." The jab echoed her earlier comment, stirring the audience. Some clapped, others murmured disapproval. Kennedy's smile returned sharper now. "Congresswoman, I don't resist change. I resist bad ideas," he said, his voice calm but biting. "Telling folks like Marcus their way of life's obsolete without a real path forward, that's a bad idea." You mentioned $10 billion for retraining, but the Government Accountability Office says most federal programs have a success rate below 40%. That means 6 out of 10 workers like Marcus are left stranded? Those are the stakes. The crowd erupted, Kennedy's facts hitting hard. He continued, unrelenting. "In Louisiana, folks near refineries deal with pollution, no question. But those jobs lifted them out of poverty, put kids through school, gave them health care. Tear that down without a ready replacement. That's not leadership. That's leaving people behind." AOC's face flushed, her confidence shaken. "Senator, you're twisting my words," she said, her voice tight but forceful. "I'm building something better. Those communities deserve clean air, water, and jobs that don't poison them. Your defense of oil ignores the billions in subsidies it gets while workers like Marcus scrape by. The problem is you're too comfortable with the status quo." Her supporters clapped, but the energy waned as Kennedy's arguments chipped away at her momentum. He tilted his head, his voice low and commanding. "I'm not defending any system. I'm defending folks who get hurt when big ideas don't match reality. You want to talk new voices? Fine. But a new voice don't mean much if it drowns out the ones keeping this country running. Then came the question that shifted everything. You keep talking about clean energy jobs. Can you name one funded approved project ready to hire someone like Marcus in the next 6 months? I've got a list of rigs and refineries hiring today. The studio fell silent, the question landing like a blow. AOC hesitated, then started. There are projects in development, like solar initiatives in New York and California, and we're working on Kennedy, cut impolite, but firm. Working on ain't hired Congresswoman. Folks like Marcus can't pay bills with working. On the crowd erupted the applause thunderous as Kennedy's question exposed a gap in AOC's vision. Social media exploded with clips of the moment, some calling it a mic drop. In the control room, CNN producers watched viewership numbers spike. Cooper tried to move on, his voice cutting through the noise. Let's reset and move to our next topic. But the audience's applause lingered. Kennedy's calm precision, turning AOC's aggression against her. The debate had become a test of who could connect with America's concerns. AOC defiant, prepared to fight back. But Kennedy had drawn a line, and the nation watched to see how she'd respond. The CNN studio buzzed with emotion, the impact of John Kennedy's sharp question to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez still lingering. The debate had shifted from policy to a profound clash of perspectives, captivating an audience now torn between focus and restlessness. AOC, her earlier confidence, rattled by Kennedy's focus on the human cost of her plans, sat with hands clasped, eyes fierce with resolve. Kennedy, calm and composed, adjusted his glasses, a faint smile hinting at his connection with the crowd. The cameras caught every detail: AOC's tense jaw, Kennedy's steady breathing. Anderson Cooper, sensing a pivotal moment, leaned into his microphone. We've heard passionate arguments tonight, he said. Before we close, share a final thought on moving forward on energy policy and beyond. Congresswoman, you first. AOC took a deep breath, her voice steady, but softer. Anderson, tonight shows how much people care about our future jobs, the environment, fairness. My vision builds a country where no one's left behind, tackling climate change while creating opportunities for all, not just the powerful. I hear workers' concerns and commit to including them through training and investment. We can't let fear stop us from doing what's right. Her words drew applause, sincere but less intense than before. As the audience grappled with Kennedy's practical points, she glanced at Kennedy, her look blending defiance and respect. Cooper turned to Kennedy. Senator, your thoughts? Kennedy leaned forward, his jaw warm yet firm, addressing the camera directly. Folks, this isn't just about policy, it's about heart. I believe in using every tool, oil, gas, renewables, to keep America strong and people working. But we've got to talk to each other, not at each other. You build a country by listening, finding common ground, and working together. Congresswoman, you've got fire, but fire needs focus to avoid burning out. Let's all listen more. That's how we'll solve this, with answers, not insults. The crowd roared applause, crossing divides as Kennedy's call for unity resonated deeply. As the applause faded, an unexpected moment unfolded off stage. AOC approached Kennedy, offering a handshake. Senator, we disagree, but I respect the fight, she said quietly. Kennedy shook her hand, smiling. Congresswoman, keep pushing. Just listen to the brief exchange caught on monitors humanized them, earning soft claps from the audience. On social media, the clip went viral with hashtags like @OutCandidKennedy trending, reflecting a nation craving civility. Cooper closed the debate. Thank you, Congresswoman Ocasio-Cortez and Senator Kennedy, for a spirited discussion. And thank you to our audience. The final ovation felt less divided, the studio alive with record-breaking viewership and online buzz. The debate hadn't solved the energy crisis, but sparked a broader conversation about bridging divides between workers in fossil fuel towns, families hit by climate disasters, and young activists. Posts on X shared personal stories, showing a hunger for connection beyond conflict. The night's lesson was clear: progress comes not from shouting or quips, but from listening, grounding bold ideas in reality and respecting people behind policies. Kennedy's calm, fact-based approach showed experience could temper passion. AOC's fire reminded all that change demands urgency, even if imperfect. Their clash revealed America's strength. Fierce debate paired with common ground. For the audience, the takeaway was a call to engage value, both the Louisiana worker and New York activist, and build a future for all. The debate ended, but its call for connection endured.